Hello everyone. Here is the review on the basic parent functions and their characteristics. Now we are not going to go in detail in all the characteristics, we're just going to look at some of the main ones. That is the domain, the range, the extrema will be minimum or maximum, the interval of increase or decrease or neither for that matter, and if this is an odd, an even or an odd function, right, or neither again. So those are the main characteristics we're going to look at. So we're not going to look at all of them. We're going to leave out the asymptotes, discontinuities, etc. And we're looking at some basic parent functions. And again, I have 10 of them here. We're not going to look at all of them. We're just going to look at some of the most common ones. The first one we want to address is the constant function. So what's a constant function? It's when you have a function y is equal to a number. So I'm going to call that c for constant. So that will just be like y equals 3, y equals -1, you know, just a number, no variable. And when it's a constant, that's just going to be a horizontal line. So you want to think about that as being a horizontal line. Wherever that constant number will be. So let's imagine that would be a y equals 3. It will be at y, you would find 3, and you would have a horizontal line at y equals 3. So we're just going to say this is at y equals c. Okay? Now, the domain, well, the domain is always the point most to the left to the point most to the right. And this function has arrows on either side, no discontinuities in between, so it's going to keep going forever. So it comes from negative infinity on the left and goes toward positive infinity on the right. For the range, well, the range will be the lowest point to the highest. Well, since this is a horizontal line, there is only one y value for this function. So the range here will just be the value c, and because it's not an interval between 2 points or 2 values, it's just one specific one. We're going to use the set notation to write that. So here we go. Extrema. Does this function have a minimum or a maximum? Well, we could argue technically that it has both, but here we're going to say neither because we don't want to go too deep into the definition here. Increase or decrease, well, this function is never increasing, never decreasing. It's constant, according to its name, right? And so we're going to say neither. And is it even or odd? Now, an even function has a symmetry over the y-axis, meaning if I would fold this over the y-axis, right, I would get the graph on top of each other, right, from the left and from the right. It's the same thing of that y-axis. And if it will be an odd function, it will be symmetric over the origin. So this is definitely symmetric in the y-axis. So this is going to be an even function. All right, a linear function. So what's a linear function? Well, this is linear too, but it's a constant. So a linear function, the parent function of a linear, will go through the origin, have a slope of 1, and it will be y is equal to x, right? It's called the identity. The identity function, because for any x you pick, the y will be the same, right? So when x is 0, y is 0. When x is 1, y is 1. When x is -1, y is -1, etc. So the x's and the y's are identical, hence we call this the identity function. So I didn't want to rewrite that every time, but we're going to know that A refers back to domain. So point most to the left, point most to the right. Well, this function does not have any discontinuity and keeps going toward the left and the right. So this also has a domain of negative infinity to positive infinity. The range, however, the lowest point to the highest point, well, that's going to be from negative infinity all the way to positive infinity. So in this case, the domain and the range are going to be identical. Right? We said that. The c will be your extrema. Well, this function doesn't have any minimum because it's going to keep going and going and going down forever. And it's going to keep going up and up and up forever. So none, no extrema. D will be the interval of increase or decrease. This is always read when we go from left to right. So as you're moving from left to right, so if you place your pencil on the left and you're going toward the right, your pencil has to go up, right? Therefore, this function is increasing everywhere. So this is increasing. And it's increasing everywhere, so from negative infinity to positive infinity on the whole domain. E is even or odd. Well, if I fold this here over the y-axis, those two segments here would not be on top of each other, right? Should call those ray, actually, is what they would be. They wouldn't be on top of each other, therefore this is not an even function. However, I have that symmetry over the origin, so this would be an odd function. Number 3 is a quadratic function. So the quadratic function, the parent function of a quadratic, would be like that, and it will be y is equal to x squared. The domain of a quadratic, there is no limit on the left, no limit on the right, no discontinuity in between, therefore the domain is from negative infinity to positive infinity. The range, however, we have a lowest point here, 0, so it's from 0, including it, right? And then it goes up to infinity. So that's my range. C will be the extrema. Well, there is no maximum because this graph is going to keep increasing toward infinity without stopping. But there is definitely a minimum value right here, so we're going to say we have a minimum. And the minimum will be y equals 0 at the vertex. D will be the interval of increase or decrease. So we have to be careful, right? Because when we are starting on the left, even though this arrow is pointing up, as you're moving from left to right, you would start here and then you will be going down, 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 all the way to the x value of 0. So your interval will be decreasing coming from negative infinity for the x value. When we talk interval of increase or decrease, we want to give the x values that are concerned. So it's decreasing coming from negative infinity all the way to 0, and then increasing from 0 all the way to positive infinity, right? Because at this point we are starting increasing, 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 so it's now increasing. E was even or odd, and if you fold this over the y-axis, the left and the right-hand side definitely will give you the same y values. So this graph is definitely going to be an even graph. This function is even. All right, number 4 is the cubic function, and the cubic function is y is equal to x cubed, and it looks like, let's see, that. Okay, so A was the domain. There is no restriction from the left to the right with no discontinuity in between, so the domain will definitely be from negative infinity to positive infinity. The range, there is no limit at the bottom, no limit at the top, so also negative infinity to positive infinity. C was our extrema. This graph does not have a minimum or a maximum. It's going to keep going down, keep going up. So we're going to say no extrema. D was increase or decrease. So again, we have to go from left to the right. So if I start on the left and I go toward the right, notice how my pen is going up, 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 up everywhere. So increasing, increasing. Even here, we're coming from just below 0, go to 0, and right after 0, we keep going up, right? So this is, even though it looks like it's flattening out, the point just before it is below, the x-axis, the one just after it is above, therefore this is still an increasing area. So this graph is going to increase everywhere. So we're going to say increasing from negative infinity to infinity. And then E is the even or odd. And this is obviously not even, because if I fold this over the y-axis, right, this branch here would not be on top of this one. However, we have the symmetry over the origin, so this is an odd function. Absolute value graph, so that would be y is equal to the absolute value of x, and so this would look like that. That's your parent function of the absolute value, and it will have a slope of 1 on the left and of -1 on the, on the right, +1, and on the left, -1. So that could really also be written as a piecewise function, where we say it is going to be a negative x if x is less than or equal to 0, and we're going to say it's going to be positive x if x is greater than 0. So either one of those will be giving us the same absolute value parent function. So for A, the domain, this graph is going to keep going toward the left and toward the right, no discontinuity in between, so it's from -infinity to infinity. The range, we obviously have a lowest point here, it's not going to go below the x-axis, and it's going to keep going up forever, so it goes from 0, including 0, to infinity. C was our extrema. We do not have a maximum because the graph keeps going up, but we definitely have a minimum. So we're going to say minimum. And what is that minimum? It's y equals 0. D was the interval of increase or decrease. So if I start on the left and I go toward the right, I'm definitely going to go down, 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 all the way to 0. And then up, 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 all the way to infinity. So it's first decreasing, so it's kind of, this is kind of like our parabola earlier, right? It's decreasing, coming from -infinity all the way to 0, and it's going to be increasing from 0 to infinity. E is even or odd, and if you fold this on the y-axis, you're going to end up with the same y values left and right, so that's definitely going to be an even function. Okay. Number 6 is the square root function, so that will be y is equal to the square root of x, and this will be like so, and that is really the inverse function of a parabola with a restriction, right? We will just have the one branch of the parabola graphed here, not both of them. So this is your square root function. The domain will start at 0 toward infinity, so from 0 to infinity, and this is because you cannot put a negative number inside a square root, right? That will give you an imaginary value, a complex number. So we see real numbers because that's how we graph on a Cartesian plane. XY plane is a Cartesian plane. Those are real numbers, and so we cannot have imaginary numbers there. So domain from 0 to infinity. The range, well, the lowest y value I have is 0, and then this one is going up very, very slowly, but it is going to keep going up. So we go from 0 to infinity for the range also. C was the extrema. Well, this graph is not going to have a maximum because it's going to keep going up, but it definitely has the lowest value, so we have a minimum. And the minimum value is y equals 0. Notice how when I talk about minimum and maximum, I always give you the y value, because it is, after all, the y that tells you how high or low you are, right, or your function is. So the y is what we want to give when we talk minimum and maximum. Is this function increasing, decreasing, or neither? Well, this function, if I start from the left, is definitely going to go up, 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 right? So it's increasing everywhere on its domain, which is from 0 to infinity. And then E is that an even or an odd function? Well, there is no symmetry because we are not going to go on the other side of the y-axis. We don't have any negative x's, so there is no symmetry there. So we're going to say none. Or neither odd nor even. There we go. 7 is your exponential graph, and we're going to use the base e, the natural exponent. So e to the x, oops, it should be an x, and that's going to look like that. So we're going to come, it's going to go up very, very slowly at first, and then woo, it's going to shoot up very quickly after a while. So this is your e to the x. The domain, well, there is no limit on the left, no limit on the right, no discontinuity in between, so from negative infinity to infinity. The range, however, even though it looks like this is going to keep going down, it definitely will not go below the x-axis. In fact, it will not even touch the x-axis. So we are not going to include 0 in our range. It's going to go and it's going to hug it very closely but never touch it. So never going to be 0, so a parenthesis there to show that, but then it's going to go up to infinity. C is an extrema. Well, since we're never going to go below the x-axis, but this graph is going to keep creeping closer and closer and closer and closer, it's really not going to have any minimum and obviously no maximum either. So we're going to say neither. D was the increase or decrease. Well, if we're going from the left toward the right, this graph from left to right definitely goes up, right? So it's increasing everywhere on its domain. And the domain is from negative infinity to infinity. And then E is even, odd, or neither. There is no symmetry over the y-axis. There is no symmetry over the origin, so it's neither. The rational function, that's also called the reciprocal, and that's y is equal to 1 over x, also called reciprocal function. And this is going to look like that. So it's going to have two branches, one that's going to look like this in quadrant 3 and one like that in quadrant 1. Okay, so there is definitely going to be a discontinuity here in the middle. So the domain will be from negative infinity all the way toward 0, but not including 0, because we are not going to touch the y-axis. So x equals 0 is not part of our domain. We're going to jump over to the other side and start again all the way to infinity. So the domain will be from negative infinity to 0, but not touch 0. So we put a parenthesis there as opposed to a bracket, or from the other side of 0 to positive infinity. And for the range, it's the same scenario, because this graph is going to come from negative infinity on the y values, and it's going to go very, very closely to the x-axis, so y equals 0, without ever really touching it. And then it's going to come from positive infinity, coming toward the x-axis without ever really touching it. So it's exactly the same range as it is the domain. There we go. C is minimum or maximum. Well, obviously this is going to keep going down, this is going to keep going up, so there is neither a minimum nor a maximum. D is increasing or decreasing. So let's look. When I'm coming from the left, this graph is definitely going down, 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 right? Then I jump over the y-axis and I end up here somewhere, and I'm definitely going to come down, 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 down. So this graph is actually decreasing everywhere on its domain. So from negative infinity to 0, jump over 0, and from 0 to positive infinity. And then is it a function that's even? Obviously not, right? Because I will not have the same y value across from the y-axis, but definitely odd because the symmetry is over the origin. So this is an odd function. All right, the sine function you might not be very familiar with, but if you're not, no panic, right? We're just going to draw it. It's going to keep going like that. And this here is going to be a positive one. This down here is going to be a negative one. The domain, well, this graph is going to keep going like that, up, down, up, down, up, down, in either direction. So the domain will be from negative infinity to positive infinity. The range, well, that graph is never going to go below -1, and it's never going to go above 1. So the range is from -1 to 1, but it definitely reaches those two values, so we want to include them by putting two brackets. C is going to be your extrema. Well, obviously, this graph is going to reach a maximum of 1 many times, because it's going to keep going up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. Every time it goes up to the max, it reaches 1. Every time it goes down to the mean, it reaches -1. So it's going to have a maximum at y equals 1. Even though it reaches it many times, it's going to still be y equals 1, and it's going to have a minimum at y equals -1. D is increase or decrease. Well, this function has a whole bunch of increase and decrease and increase and decrease. So I'm going to put a little star here, and I'm going to skip for now, okay? We're going to look at that when we're going to do those in class, but for now we're just going to skip that, because we have to talk about the period of a sine function, and you might not be familiar with all of that at all, so we're just going to skip for now. Even or odd? Well, this is obviously not even, right, because otherwise I would have that graph going up here, but it's definitely odd, right, because this here and this here, those are the same two things across from the origin, so that's definitely an odd function. All right, and the cosine is the cousin really of the sine function. It's just a sine function translated sideways, so it will look like that. And this here is also going to be 1, that is going to be -1. So the domain would also be from -infinity to +infinity. The range would also be from -1 to +1, right? Notice how those two are going to be the same graphs. They're going to just translated, so they're just shifted left or right, right? C, well, it has a minimum at y equals -1 and the maximum at y equals 1. D will be increase or decrease, and just like above for the sine, we're going to put a little star there and say skip for now, because we don't want to talk about periodicity of a trig function yet. And then is that even or odd? Well, obviously if I would fold over the y-axis, I would get the same y values on either side, right, wherever I would go, and so that's definitely going to be an even function. All right, so that's going to be it for our basic parent functions.